Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having us here today. We're super excited to see this AI museum network in Germany, and we hope that what we share here today is helpful for your future work as well. So we are going to give an overview of our museum and AI network project and present some of the case studies that in detail, so you can see the possibilities of using AI. And then we're going to do a practical exercise using one of the actually outputs of the project, which was a toolkit for those museums who want to get started on using AI. Okay, so we all know that museums are now collecting a lot of data more than ever, especially because of all the digital offering that we have. So when a visitor books a ticket online, they register on the website, then they come to the museum, they log into the Wi-Fi, they may rent an audio guide, they may connect to social media, they may share their experience on TripAdvisor, maybe go and purchase the catalog after their visit from the online shop. So all those interactions with the museum is generating a lot of data. So AI uses data, so that's where the opportunity comes. So when I can go to the next slide, this network was founded basically to think about the possibilities of using all the data from visitor interactions, but also from the collection. We had this idea of seeing what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, but also discussing the ethical implications of using AI. This came from a partnership with myself and Oonagh, so from Pratt and Goldsmiths, but also we partnered at the beginning with 3 museums, the National Gallery, the Met, and the American Museum of Natural History. And this project was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. So just to give you an idea of museums using AI, we did this mapping exercise, trying to look at blogs, press releases, examples from that have been recorded in journal articles to see what is the landscape of museums using AI. So you can see here the different AI technologies, and also those represent the number of projects done by museums over time. So we were able actually to map about 120 museums that have used AI. I added here the link, so you can see the detail of all those projects. And also, if your project is not there, please, there is a form in this document where you can add your example. We publish it with a Creative Commons license, so you can use it and share it with other people. So we also ask you before this meeting to fill in the survey. So thank you so much for filling that in. It was very useful for us to prepare this talk, and we ask you about what interest in regards to AI, and also how familiar you are with, if you have basically done a project of not. So in terms of interest, you can see here that many of you are interested in machine learning, computer vision, natural processing language, and in terms of usage of AI, there is a kind of a interesting distribution. So when you go to the next slide, we can see that that chart that shows that about 10% of, if we put them together, a third of this audience have conducted a project using AI or are planning to do it in the next 12 months. Then we have other participants here who have never done a project, but actually they are interested in the possibilities. And we also have some researchers and organizations that are also interested to see, what are the current usage of AI in museums. So here are some quotes from some of you where you express that interest to basically understand that landscape. So that's basically what we are going to present today. So I'm going to hand over to Oonagh, who's going to present some of these case studies.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that kind of provides you with a helpful context in terms of the amount of museums that are using AI technologies, and really a foundation for where our study and our research really began. So I'm going to talk you through quite briefly a number of different case studies to give you some practical examples of what these technologies look like and what solutions they might offer in a museum context. So the first example I'm going to show you is one from the National Gallery in London. The National Gallery in London developed a predictive analytics dashboard, and they used a range of different data points to help create this predictive analytics model that would essentially allow them to predict how many visitors they would have on any given day to paid exhibitions. And so some of the data points that they looked at included the amount of money that had been spent on marketing for the exhibition, the time of the year, how far through the run of the exhibition, so how long had the exhibition been on for. But one of their most influential data points was actually the artist's popularity on Wikipedia. What's quite interesting about this case study is that this data was seen as public within the institution. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see what this dashboard looks like. And every member of staff within the gallery had access to this dashboard. So not only was this shaping how the institution was planning exhibitions, it was also bringing in members of staff from across the organisation into a conversation about the value of data and how it could be used to shape practice. The next example then looks at natural language processing. And it's an example from the American Museum of Natural History. American Museum of Natural History collects a lot of data from their visitors in terms of TripAdvisor comments, but also they send all of their visitors a post-visit survey where they ask about their experience. And some of that data is qualitative, so visitors can write a response. That is obviously quite time-consuming and expensive to analyse. And so they used IBM's Watson as a way to analyse vast amounts of qualitative data quite quickly. Whilst they were able to process more data than they could themselves using IBM Watson and natural language processing, what they found was that it was really important that they were able to interpret it themselves. So human augmentation was central to the success of being able to use these technologies as a way to understand and gain insights into what visitors had told them about their experience. So another example here using natural language processing. This is from the Museum of Science in Boston. Ada and Grace, two virtual guides or educators, answered visitors' questions, but they also suggested exhibits, and interestingly, they also explained the technology that made them work. So this is an interesting example of how museums can have a conversation about the technologies that they're using. It wouldn't be a talk about AI if we didn't include at least one robot. So this is probably the case study I know the least about, but I always feel like we should have a robot because it's what people expect. But this is a nice example of a robot that is used at Smithsonian museums in America. The robot is called Pepper, and these robots were donated by SoftBank Robotics to the museum. The museum is testing them in a number of different ways. One example is that the National Museum of African Art is using Pepper to translate Kiswahili phrases into English, so as a mode of active language translation. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Pepper is helping to attract and orientate visitors to the Rosa Parks virtual experience. So the robotic component is in many ways interacting, engaging with visitors in the same way that a human would, but the screen on the front is using a range of different AI technologies, including natural language processing, to communicate and have a conversation with visitors. From the survey that you completed, we know that a number of you are quite interested in computer vision or machine vision, as the term is interchangeably used. This is an example from Cooper Hewitt's Smithsonian Design Museum in New York, called Dive into Colour from 2018. And here you can see how a researcher, Dr. Olivia Vane, developed a search by colour function for the museum's collection, particularly important for a design collection. Another example of using computer or machine vision can be seen from the Tate IK Prize winner in 2016. Fabrica Recognition used live images from news platforms and analysed them against the museum's collection, looking for visual similarities with contemporary news stories alongside the historic collection. The process of that matching was publicly on display in galleries, and you can see here the white text really is the visual processing of the similarities, so that members of the public, when they viewed the exhibition, could gain insights into how this computer saw the world and the visual judgments that it was making. This example from Harvard Art Museum is quite useful in going a little bit deeper in terms of understanding how computers or machines see the world. On the left, you can see a piece of contemporary art, and on the right, you can see how 4 different computer vision tools categorized and defined this work of art. So what we do is computers are good at seeing basic things. Show it an apple, show it a dog, it's quite happy. But if we show it some contemporary art, that's quite challenging. I think my favorite one from this is Microsoft is 39% sure that it's a bathroom wall with some graffiti on it. So I think we're safe to say that computer vision technologies are not replacing computers or curators anytime soon. But instead, what they can do is help to support curators in the way that they're able to catalogue and make their collections accessible. And so John Stack from the Science Museum Group, my doorbell, I'm probably getting something really exciting delivered. John Stack from the, I'm going to go and answer my door. This is very random, but I'm going to do it because he's going to keep ringing the bell, isn't he? Thank you very much. Hello, I have been delivered plants. It's very exciting. Okay, so John Stack from the Science Museum created this really nice tool for one of our network events called What the Machine Saw. And you can see the link at the bottom here, so it's still active. You can go and click through. And what it does is it runs the Science Museum collection through a number of computer vision tools. And what you can see on the right-hand side here is a variety of categories of what the computer has defined these objects to be. So again, what we see top right, it's complicated. It's not a simple object. And as such, the computer really struggles to define what it is. This is likely to change as these technologies become more sophisticated, but it's quite useful to see where we're at now in terms of how these computers can see and understand our collections. So we've kind of given you a bit of context. We've shown you the numbers of museums using these tools. I've shown you a couple of examples of what this looks like in practice. But one of the big things that we need to be quite conscious of in this space is thinking about ethics and the social and ethical role and purpose that museums have within societies. And I think this quote from Ross Perry really sums that up quite well. And he says, as the museum moves into new social, situated, sensory and semantic media spaces, so its ethical framework needs to adjust and respond to the implications and consequences of these new interactions and interventions. And so that's a really important consideration. Yes, there's lots of opportunity and that's exciting, but we also need to remember that we work in or with museum collections and they have a certain function within society. And so really it's our role as researchers and museum professionals to think about what is the best way to engage with these technologies to help us further the work that we do. So I'm going to pass back to Elena.
Thank you. So following on that point about ethics and biases, I want us to think about the data workflow. So if we think about how AI works, basically we input some data that is processed by the algorithm, and then we get an output from that processing. So in each of the data cycle process, there are some important ethical considerations that we have to think about. How is the data being collected? Do we have data governance in place at the museum? When we think about the algorithm, how transparent is it? We always talk about that black box that transforms the data. So if we use, for example, technologies from technical companies, what are the ethical implications of that work? And then when we got the data back from the machine, from the algorithm, how do we evaluate that that is what we wanted, that has been, that is okay, and that the bias that it has doesn't, is ethical. So I'm gonna show you some examples of whether the conclusions of some of these projects. And of course, in that process, the training is an important factor that we have to consider. And one of the things that we discussed in the network was that we need more data to train algorithms, even for museums that have large collections like the Met of the American Natural History Museum. When it comes to train the data and use it with their own collection, the data is very limited. I like this quote from Jeannie Choi, Collection Information Manager from the Met, that says that they only have 600 cats to train the collection. And they come from all this time, all these art time periods. So they are not enough to train the algorithm. Another aspect that was discussed when it comes to bias and errors is that in many cases, there is lack of, if you go to the next slide, lack of context and interpretation. So machines are very good at, identifying shape, color, but, when they look, for example, at this sculpture, and they clearly identify that it's a sculpture, so it's good for that, but it doesn't provide the context and the interpretation that a human can give to that object. So it's not able to identify that that's Cleopatra, and the same we found with other historical people in the artwork presented. And the next one, which already Oonagh mentioned, is accuracy is one of the biggest challenges. And I added here some other examples. And one of my favorites is the one on the right-hand side, the diaper bag, identified here by the machine. So those are things that we need really to consider in that data cycle when we apply AI technologies. I'm going to hand over again to Oonagh to conclude. Yeah, muted. Classic.
Thanks. One of the challenges that we face in using these technologies, particularly from commercial technology providers, is that quite often we don't have access to the black box. We don't know how decisions are made. And so we need to mitigate and understand those biases within our own institutions and think about them within the context of the bias that is inherent within the technology that we might be using. the creation of metadata and mass data analysis is really appealing for busy museum professionals, whether that's making your collection more accessible by creating new metadata so it can be searched, or analysing vast amounts of visitor comments and feedback. But we also need to be aware of the potential problems that they can generate as well. So if we think about bias, it's inherent in museums because museums are curated and created by humans. It's also inherent in machines because they're programmed by humans. So if you put these two together, what we get is bias squared. And that's really the multiplier that occurs when museum bias is multiplied by machine bias. And why is that a problem for museums? Well, whilst museums are working to eradicate bias in their collections, some more radically so than others, by simply adopting AI technologies, museums could create new modes of bias and unknowingly introduce new modes of bias which exist in parallel to or in contrast to wider approaches to decolonization in another department. So understanding these technologies, or more specifically often the training data that they use, how did they learn to see the world? The data that they use to teach the machine and the algorithms used to make decisions is crucial to understanding the integrity of any application of these technologies within museums. So really this is it's important to remember to press pause and think about the potential unintended consequences that these technologies might have. And so together as a network, we defined a series of questions that focus on visitor data, but also collections data that we think are important to have when it comes to developing AI-focused projects in museums and galleries. So I'll not read all of these, I'll pick out a couple, but if we look at visitor data, that first question, do museums have the necessary data governance and processes in place to manage AI? What's the process that you go through to get approval to collect visitor data, to process visitor data, and apply the results? How do you use that data? If we look then at collections data, how can museums minimize algorithm biases to interpret their collections? So what steps can a museum take? And this might be something that's quite simple. It might simply be human augmentation. So you might use machine vision tools to generate metadata for your collection, which makes it more searchable. But before you adopt those metadata terms into your collection, a human checks them to confirm that they are appropriate and they're accurate. So some of these questions are big theoretical questions, and others are simply designed to help museum professionals to think strategically and practically about how to implement these technologies. So I think the case studies we've shown you so far today really show that museums are at this critical juncture in the use of AI technologies within the cultural sector. And for me, we're really faced with a choice. We can either blindly adopt what is possible and what is affordable from third-party vendors, or we can engage in a public, critical, yet constructive process of development that can really support ethically robust technology use within museums, but also have a wider influence on these technologies in society. So one of the things we're really keen within our work in the network was really to turn theory into practice. We had lots of great conversations, but how can those conversations be turned into practical resources for museum professionals? And so Through a process of workshop formats and open dialogues with museum professionals, we tested out a number of different forums and formats to see what would help to generate a constructive format to be used by a variety of museum professionals when developing AI-focused projects. And we translated those early conversations into a series of prototype worksheets, which we then brought back to our network and asked them to use in a variety of different scenarios. And one of the things that we said when we created these worksheets was, we know they're not perfect. So alongside using them, we also want you to tell us what's missing from them or what we should take out. And from there, we arrived at a series of worksheets that were then presented in an AI toolkit. So there's 3 worksheets, and each worksheet has the worksheet component on the right-hand side, so space to do your working out, to complete. And on the left-hand side, there's detailed instructions of how these worksheets can be used to help you in your development process. So we have 3 worksheets. The first one looks at ethics workflow. The second one looks at stakeholder management. And the third one looks at AI capabilities and really talks about resources and tools and data needed to successfully develop an AI project. And so today we're going to look at one of these worksheets in more detail. And I think at this point, yes, I'm going to pass back to Elena, who's going to talk about how we're going to use this worksheet in more detail.
So one of the worksheets that was very useful for the group in order to think about starting an AI project, computer vision from the case studies presented during the network. And I think they are very practical. So when we developed this project, we thought about the practical implications. So we hope those recommendations are useful for your upcoming work in this area. So thank you so much for having us here today. Here's our Twitter and email addresses. So thank you so much for having us here.
Yeah, and I think my last thing I'd just say is, if you have worked on an AI project and we haven't got it represented in our spreadsheet, please do get in touch. There's a link on the form. We're really keen to add as many examples as possible. So we'd love to have your projects, whether they're projects you've already completed, or if you want to come back to us in 6 months when you've developed a project out of the network that's been set up in Germany, do keep in touch, because we're keen to see how this project develops.
Great.